There, I am glad you can make it today. Our lesson comes from the book of Acts, chapter 14, and we continue to follow Paul and Barnabas as they go on their uh, missionary journey, you'd call it. It's often called the first missionary journey of Paul, and we'll stick with that designation for it. So you may recall that they had started off in the Syrian Antioch, the one where the church was very strong, and they had gone to Cyprus. Then they went to a different Antioch. We can call it the Turkish Antioch. And they had had some success there, but then they had to leave town because some of the people didn't like what they were saying. And this had to do usually with the Jewish people who were there being divided. Some would be in favor of Paul and Barnabas and hearing the message they had to say, and some wouldn't. And that's kind of normal for a lot of people who, once they decide something, they don't want to change their minds, even if they hear something else that makes sense or makes more sense or is accurate. And that's unfortunate because they ended up driving away Paul and Barnabas, who had to leave town. There were believers still in the Turkish Antioch, and they had their own congregation by the time Paul and Barnabas left. Now, Paul and Barnabas then went to Iconium, which was some distance away, but not too far. You'd have to think that they were walking wherever they're going. So even what we would think of as a short distance could be a long way to go. So they get into Iconium. They do what they're used to doing, which is going to the synagogue and talking with the Jewish people there because they're the ones who would understand the scriptures that have already been delivered and are available. And they have some people there, just like in Turkish Antioch, they have some people there who hear what they have to say and they believe it, they want to hear more. And then you have some people who are resistant to it. And this comes to a head later on because the people who are against them, it seems like they get pretty jealous of all of the attention that Paul and Barnabas are receiving. And if you combine that with their not wanting anyone to be preaching something different from what they're used to, that's kind of a recipe for problems. And that is what happens. They decide that they're going to stone Paul and Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas get word of this and they go ahead and leave the city. But in this case, they have also left behind a congregation that will remain. From here, they go to Lystra. Now, I don't know if this was intentional, if it was by accident, or if it was a matter of the Holy Spirit guiding them to this city, because there's no synagogue there. There may be some Jewish people, but generally you have to have, or at least in those days, you'd have to have 10 Jewish men in order to have a synagogue. The fact that there's not a synagogue there means there could be Jewish people in the city, but not enough to form a synagogue. So, uh, what Paul does at this time is he begins speaking to the Gentiles, of which that's pretty much all there is in this city, and they don't know anything about the real God. These people worship the Greek pantheon, meaning Zeus, Mercury, Apollo, all of those characters. And Paul is speaking, and the people are listening to him. And finally, Paul sees this one man who has been unable to walk all of his life. There's a problem with his feet. Paul sees that this man has the faith and believes what he's saying. And he tells the man to stand up and walk. And the man does. So there's a miracle here. Now, there had been miracles done back in Iconium, and it had been popular, but it had not kept the forces against Paul and Barnabas from being able to rise up and drive them out of the city. Well, here, there's a very different reaction. The people see this and they are amazed. And they have, a lot of them have their own language, meaning this area of the world had its own language. And so they're speaking in their own language. Paul and Barnabas do not understand. But then they soon realize that they think Barnabas is Zeus and that Paul is Hermes, because Zeus is the primary god of the Greek pantheon, but Hermes was a lesser one, but he was there to deliver messages. That's what he was known for. And so they think, okay, this is great, and there's a temple to Zeus outside the city, and there's a priest who works there, and he decides, okay, these are the gods, and we are going to sacrifice in their honor. And so they're preparing to do that. Well, Paul and Barnabas don't know what's going on at first, but suddenly they realize what is happening, and they do what good followers of God would do during that time. They tear their clothes. We may think, what what is that? Well, we don't do that now, at least where we are. Some people may still do it in certain areas, but uh, that's just a cultural thing. But you have to remember that clothing was extremely difficult to come by and expensive. And so when a Jewish person saw something that went against God or was something that God would not like and they knew it, they would tear their clothing. And so it might not be the whole thing, it might just be a strip, but it was a sign that they were upset about this. And they go to the people and they say, no, no, we are not these gods. And Paul starts telling them about the real God. And that seems to calm down the people. But somehow word gets back to Iconium, to the Jewish people there, that Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra. Well, they send some of their people there. Now, you're wondering, how would they know that they were there? Well, I'm thinking that there could have been a few Jewish people who were there, not enough to make a synagogue, but enough to say, hey, we better go tell somebody about this. And they have time to head back to Iconium, tell the folks there, and then they send a party and they get the people stirred up. And suddenly the people overall are against Paul and Barnabas. Somehow Barnabas manages to avoid any problems, but Paul gets stoned, and that's a terrible thing. And it seems like in this case, maybe the people of Lystra joined in with this, and I'll say the people of Lystra because there was a church established here, and this congregation obviously did not jump in with the stoning. They are there and they witness what's going on. And so um, a Jewish punishment of the day would be to take rocks and just throw them over and over until the person who's the target of that is killed. Well, Paul falls and they check him. They say, okay, he's dead. They drag his body outside of the city and leave it there. And then they're gone. Well, the disciples show up, and that's an indication to us that it's the people of the congregation. And then Barnabas, somehow he had gotten away, but he's there, and they go out to Paul. And then Paul comes to, and he's able to get up. And now he's hurting, but he's able to get up. And then they go back into the city. And you think, wait a second, what is this? He's just been stoned, and he's going back into the city. Well, he does, but the next day, he and Barnabas leave. Well, they go on to a couple of other places, but eventually they double back and they go back through Lystra and Iconium and the Turkish Antioch. And when they go back, they're going back to visit the churches that they have established, the congregations that are there. and they appoint elders. Now, the elders would be people to don't really want to say be in charge of the congregation, but they're the ones to lead and take care of the people and help organize things for the people in the congregation so that they can take care of one another, and that uh, they will also be able to teach one another. And the elders would be ones who would know more and be able to pass that along. And there are contact group as well. So they go back to these congregations, to places where they've been in big trouble. And the way I read it, it seems like they're not trying to go to the whole city, but go to the congregation, strengthen them, and then now it's going to be the work of the congregations to reach the other people for God. Well, Paul and Barnabas left the Turkish Antioch after being to the other two cities. They'd go to a couple more places, and apparently there are no problems there. At least there are none that are recorded. And then they take a ship back to the Syrian Antioch, the original congregation who sponsored them and sent them out. So that closes out the first missionary journey that Paul makes. And it's been an eventful one. And it's an important one because, as we see, the church is spreading. Now, there are other people who go out, and their stories are not recorded for us. So we can think that this may be fairly typical for all of the apostles who have gone out, especially the ones we don't hear anything about once Jesus returns to heaven. But we do know that most of them ended up leaving Jerusalem and going somewhere else. Now, our lesson from all of this is that there will be people who resist us as we try to tell them about Jesus. There's not a lot we can do about that. We can't make them listen to us. We can't force them to believe. What we can do is love the people we're talking to, be kind to them, do what we can for them, and hope that they can see that by our lives, they can have something they may not realize is available to them. Another part of this is that we can move on to people who will listen and form bonds of friendship with them and be able to support them even as they support us. So with that, I am going to leave this lesson with you. I will show you my tie. Now, this tie has symbols on it that used to be considered medical symbols, and then they realized that it was wrong, and the true medical symbol was a staff with a single snake on it, one snake. This one is actually a sign that indicates Hermes. Now, in this case, they thought, the people of Lystra thought that Paul was Hermes. We know better than that. Just like the way this tie was intended was not what it actually represents. So you can think about that one for a little while and ask someone to explain it to you if it doesn't make sense, because it can get a little confusing. So I will leave you and hope you have a good evening and hope you can be back soon. Bye.